Thank you all for joining us today for Public Speaking 101 workshop. Joining us are Rachel Allen, visiting lecturer in the Department of Communication Studies, and Stephanie Willis, visiting lecturer in the Department of Communication Studies also. They are going to share with us how to share effective and engaging stories and presentations. I'm going to hand it over to them to get us started.
Hello everyone, welcome. I am Rachel.
And I'm Stephanie Willis.
We're here to give you some public speaking tips today to help you prepare for any upcoming presentations that you may have.
Cool, so to start off, everybody in the chat, really quick, tell us if you've actually ever been excited to give a speech or a presentation. All honesty, I see some head shaking here. Yes, okay, did not expect that. Anxiety is the same thing as excitement, sure, yeah. Okay, so you never know how your audience is going to react. Keep that in mind. So if anybody's ever watched Seinfeld, he tells this joke in one of his stand-up comedy routines that the #1 thing that people fear most is public speaking. The second thing people fear is death. So think about that for a second. So what this means is that if you're at a funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than delivering the eulogy. So if you do feel not excited and you get nervous and you're scared of it, it's okay. You're not alone. So I'm going to hand it over to Rachel and she's going to get started with the beginning of our presentation.
We just want to play the, well, maybe not.
There's no volume.
Okay, so today we're going to go over a few things. First, we're going to start with some strategies for overcoming what we call in the comm studies field, communication apprehension, although you may more commonly know it as speech anxiety. Then we're going to go into some tips and some tricks for preparing a speech or presentation. Then we'll move into some techniques to improving your presentation or delivery skills. And finally, Stephanie will wrap us up by talking about how we should adapt our presentations to a variety of audiences. So let's go ahead and begin. Now, I first want to start off by talking about some major misconceptions when it comes to speaking publicly to audiences. First, my speech or presentation must be perfect like a performance. Now, this should not be the case. We should never think of a speech or a presentation as being like a performance, and there's a right or a wrong way of going about it. That puts a lot of undue pressure on us that can actually just inhibit us from executing our speech. Second, I should memorize my speech word for word. Now, there are going to be some situations, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on today, in which we should go about memorizing speeches. But in most occasions, we should never put this pressure on ourselves to memorize a speech or presentation word for word. And then finally, I look as nervous as I feel. Most of the times, and I'm not going to say all the time because there will be times in which you're nervous and we will be able to tell. But most of the times, a lot of the actual physical effects of communication apprehension are very internal. So for example, can y'all tell how fast my heart is beating right now? Can y'all tell how sweaty my palms are? No. So a lot of these physical effects are more internal and we can't tell unless it really comes through with your voice. So you should always try to fake it until you make it in these situations because we're not going to be able to tell if you are nervous. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the strategies of overcoming communication apprehension or speech anxiety.
So I
who
have
here
a quick
knows
question,
what it feels like?
if it's okay to ask.
Okay, go for it.
Sure. So I know, if it's like kind of like sweating or like heart beating fast type of, nervousness, I know we can, fake it like you recommended. But for me, when I'm like nervous, my voice is shaking and it's kind of too obvious to kind of hide it. In that case, what would you recommend to, fake it kind of?
Practice, practice, practice. And I'm going to talk about this here in a moment. When it comes to practicing, what is key is that you practice with an audience and not just an audience that you feel comfortable with. So not your friends or your family or your colleagues. What I like to tell my students is I want you to go practice just across the way out at GUA. So if you've ever been to Greenspun Hall before, the second floor, the little open area space, I say go find someone, make a friend, feel uncomfortable, and practice with them. So in those situations, you should always try to emulate the situation that you're going to be speaking in. So if you know that you're not going to know anybody in the audience, well, then go find an audience that you don't know, some strangers, and practice on them. So that's one of the key tips. So I actually want to ask you all a question. To recall the last time you spoke publicly, and it can be in front of like an audience of 2 people, 5, or an audience of 50 people. Did you feel nervous? Now that's a bit of a rhetorical question because you probably did. And I'm just making an assumption here. But now I want you to imagine you were in the movie Click and you could freeze time and go kind of outside of your body and talk to yourself. What would you say to yourself in that instance to make you feel less nervous? You would yell, okay.
Feel free to unmute yourself too if you'd like.
So I'm curious, I think is it Jarrett or Jeanette? Jeanette, what would you yell?
Oh, if like time is freeze,
Yes.
then I think I was just like yelling like like some kind of let it out.
Okay, so let some of that anxiety out. Absolutely, that can definitely be useful. Restart. Okay, Monica, why would you restart? I may not have been expecting. I'm like asking you guys questions, calling you out a little bit.
Because I think if I saw, if I recognized in myself that that I was nervous enough to make a mistake, I would want to acknowledge that, reflect on that, and then start over again.
Okay, so get some of those mistakes out of the way and then start fresh?
Right.
Absolutely, that would be a great tool. If only we actually had that real remote in life.
Take a deep breath.
Take a deep breath. Do a power pose. Yes, do some of the Amy Cuddy power poses. So a lot of the times when I pose this question to my students in class, what they respond with is, number one, I would have been more prepared. I would have put things down in writing and I would have practiced them. Number two, one of the most common answers is they would say, I would just tell myself to calm down, that I'm actually doing okay and I'm giving a good presentation. And it's kind of all in my mind, these feelings that I'm having. And that's really some of the major tips when it comes to managing communication apprehension. So unfortunately, what I will say is that if you experience COMAP and if you experience what we call COMAP to a high degree, that communication apprehension, unfortunately, is a feeling that never goes away, but it gets better as you get more experience and as you put yourself in those situations in which you speak a lot. I once was someone who experienced high amounts of communication apprehension, and I still feel that anxiety. In fact, I'm feeling a little bit of it right now, but that's normal. That just means that you care about that speech or that presentation that you're giving. So one of the first things that can be helpful in managing your communication apprehension is actually reframing the situation. So when you are going to give a speech, instead of viewing it as a performance in which you are trying to, give this perfect performance for the audience, view it as a conversation. When you have a conversation with your friend or your family, do you ever stumble over your words? Probably. I definitely do that all the time. You should also have that frame of mind when it comes to any sort of presentation or speeches that I'm going to make a mistake. There's no perfect way of going about this presentation. And that's one of the themes that we're definitely going to hit home today is there is no perfect presentation. It all depends. It all depends on what you're trying to convey, the occasion, and who's in the audience. So if you can frame the situation as a conversation with a friend, that's going to help you reduce your anxiety. And of course, the second tip is practice. Practice, practice, and then do some more practicing. Now, don't practice in the same manner that you do the first time you practice. Like I said earlier, when you get into these situations in which you're preparing, you've already written your speech or your presentation, and now you're just practicing it, utilize different strategies. So practice with an audience that makes you feel uncomfortable. It may be good to start out practicing with a roommate or a friend, but then move to a stranger. Practice with a professor. Come and practice in the comm lab, which we're going to talk about at the end of today's presentation. Practice with your pets. Your pets are great at letting you know if you're monotone or not. If you're very excited, they'll get excited. I do this all the time with my dog. Her tail starts wagging and she's like, treats? I'm like, no, not treats, comm app. So practice in situations that emulate what you're going into. So if you're giving a research presentation, maybe the 3-minute thesis, practice on some of your professors and have them give you some feedback. And then desensitization. Now this comes with, again, a lot more practice, but repetitive desensitization requires that you take every speaking opportunity that you are given. So it may be something where an inconsequential opportunity, maybe you're asked to speak at your little brother's soccer game, or maybe you're asked to speak at your friend's wedding, whatever it may be. Say yes to every single opportunity that you're given, because the more that you put yourself in those kind of uncomfortable situations, the more that you're going to find is that they're not that uncomfortable. The more that you will feel confident and poised. So along with that, some other things that you can do. You can utilize relaxation techniques. Now this can be different for each one of us. For me, what I find relaxing is just going on a walk and listening to music. Stephanie can attest to this. When I put on some music and I'm walking around, I'm dancing, and that gets me out of thinking about my anxiety. For some people, it may be practicing breathing techniques. That's not necessarily the best thing for me. And so a lot of it is finding what works best for you. Some people like to do like push-ups or do something that gets their heart rate up. Whatever it may be, utilize those strategies that can help you get your mind off of what you're about to do and be present in the moment. Now, along with that, it's also helpful to eat a healthy meal the morning of, or lunch or dinner, depending on when your presentation is. But make sure that you eat a nice, nutritious meal. Get some fruits in there if you can. Try to avoid food that has a lot of sugar in it, high sugar content, or a lot of caffeine, because that can sometimes amp up your anxiety a little more. So eat foods that you know are going to help you settle your stomach. And then finally, don't be your own worst enemy. Now, there's no way of going about this, but you are going to put some pressure on yourself to do well, right? You care about your presentation, or at least you care about getting a good grade on that presentation. And so there's pressure there, but you should never have any sort of negative thoughts or attitudes towards yourself, because that's just going to impact your execution of that presentation. So visualize success. Instead of saying, I'm unprepared, say, I made this presentation, so I know best what I'm talking about. So make sure that you aren't getting in your own way and that you are supporting yourself just like you would support a friend who you know is going into a presentation situation. So there's many more strategies out there about communication apprehension. These are just some of the ones that we find work for our students, that work for us. But of course, if you ever have any questions about other strategies that you can utilize, like, let us know. Come reach out to us and we'll talk about that. Or you can come see us in the communication lab. So now I'm going to hand it over to Steph. She's going to talk about a few tips and tricks for writing your speech.
Thank you. love the tips because I was over there doing deep breathing and I had to come up here again, right? It really does help. It really does. So I'm going to go over some tips and tricks to writing your speech because that is a really number one thing is to organize your speech is to first prepare it. But before you start writing anything down and getting ready, you need to know the purpose of your speech. And there are numerous amounts of types of speeches that you can give. One of the most common ones is an informative speech. And when you're thinking about an informative speech, you usually have a topic or an issue that you're just explaining to your audience. So when you explain that information, you want to make sure that the audience is then aware of your topic. And then you really get in there and you inform them and you provide all these like specific details about that topic. And then when you're talking about a persuasive speech, there's many strategies, but we teach this one to our students and it's called Monroe's motivated sequence. And so there's a lot of steps to this, but the key idea here is first, you need to draw their attention in. You need to let them know why this issue is important. And then like the need is the next thing, right? So what is the problem that needs addressing? If you're in a persuasive speech, you're trying to persuade somebody to do something, to fix the problem, to make some sort of change in some way. And so really address that and make sure that your audience knows that it's an important thing. And then the next thing is satisfaction. And this is ways that we need to fix the problem. If there's a problem, there's got to be a solution, right? And you might not know an exact solution, but you'll have to put on your thinking cap, go in and do some research, and you might find one solution and you might find 4 solutions. But if you know the purpose of that speech and your time constraints, then you can identify how many different solutions you can add into that speech. So the next thing then is visualization. And this is where you as a confident speaker are going to use really colorful language. You're going to use vivid imagery in your words, perhaps alliterations and metaphors. And even in your visual aid, you could add a lot of photos that complement your persuasive topic. And this really helps your audience then visualize those solutions that you're presenting to them. And then the final step in Monroe's motivated sequence is this call to action. So if you're persuading your audience to do something or believe something, the best thing to do at the end of a speech in your conclusion then is what steps can you do to make that solution a reality? So these are just 2 different purposes. Let's get into something that might be even helpful as graduate students. So maybe you're an intern or you have, you're working in the department, whatever department you're in, whatever college you're in, and you need to develop a marketing campaign for that department. Maybe you're going to do the 3-minute thesis that's coming up here soon. Maybe you're going to do a research symposium, perhaps with research posters or something like that. All of these speeches require different things, right? So if you know what the purpose of that speech is, that's like step number 1. And you also might be thinking about, I'm going to have to defend this prospectus at some point. I'm also going to have to defend a thesis, possibly a dissertation, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to present at conferences also. And all of these things have different situations and different contexts, rules and regulations of giving that speech. So that's number 1. Before you start organizing on paper, know what you're going to do first in that speech or presentation. All right, honesty time again here, folks. How many of you have just said, it's fine, I got this, I'm just going to wing it? Guilty? Same. Yes, got some yeses. Not yet. All right, I admit, I have definitely winged it before, and it was really an utter fail on my part. Completely froze and ended up walking off stage and not delivering the speech at all because I didn't practice. I didn't know what I was talking about. I just winged it. So for me, it didn't work out well. So I don't recommend it in most cases unless you're just like super amazing And come talk to me then if you can do that, because I need to learn your skills. So we don't want to wing it. So what we want to do is we want to outline. So regardless of what kind of speech you're giving, even if it's your dissertation defense, you're going to have something written down. This image that's on the PowerPoint here, you can see, is just kind of a generic version of what that looks like. Even if you just have bullet points, kind of how we have on all of our slides, that can actually just help you, right? You've got like our introductions are to the left margin, and then the other things that are like subpoints underneath that. That's just going to keep us organized and know where we're at. So the first thing that comes in an outline when you're writing these are introductions. You might have noticed at the beginning of the speech, I tried to do something funny. I used a famous quote, skit from Seinfeld, right? So that is the idea to grab the audience's attention. It could be maybe a startling statistic. It could even be perhaps a research finding from the research that you're doing. It could be an anecdote as well. I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit because stories are really powerful. So after introductions, then you're going to have main points. And like I said, these are like just ways to keep you organized before you start practicing your speech. So when we talk about outlining, like for example, Rachel and I's styles are different. When I outline, I like to write out word for word everything I'm going to say. Rachel's like, no, I just like fragments, 1 or 2 words, and then I know exactly what I'm going to say. And everybody's different, right? So there's no right or wrong there. It's what works best for you so that you can practice well. So like my main points in my outline are all word for word. I want to know what I'm going to say. But then when I'm practicing it later on, I don't ever say exactly what I'm going to say or what I have written down. It changes and develops after I practice, which is great because then it doesn't sound like I've memorized it and I'm not really robotic. So that gets that conversational tone. So these main points that you have here are just essentially topic sentences or even new ideas in your speech. So when you go from one idea to the next one, that's when you have a new main point. And as you're organizing this, these can ebb and flow, and you can even change your mind and put something you think you want to talk about first and move that around. But another key thing here in this outlining is to include transitions. And I know when you see it on paper, it looks really repetitive and it just doesn't feel right. But believe us, Rachel and I teach COM 101, it is the best thing to have a transition between your intro to from your introduction to your main points, and then between each main point, and then toward your, between the body where all your main points are to your conclusion. Because you want to keep your audience engaged and you want to be sure that they know where you're at. So one of these key tips in a transition is to talk about what you just talked about and then tell your audience what you're going to talk about next. So if I were to give a transition right now, I would say, now that I've gone over the introduction and main points and transitions, I'll now go over how to do a proper conclusion. So then my audience knows where I'm at. And like I said, it looks weird on paper when you're outlining, but it really helps your audience follow along in this conversation and not like, where are we at? I don't even know what we're talking about right now, right? You don't want that. So transitions help with that a lot. And then we have the conclusions. So really what a conclusion should do is summarize everything you talked about. You could restate your thesis, perhaps your research findings or implications for future research. And the idea here with a conclusion is just to come full circle. So if you started off with a startling statistic or a famous quote, come back to that and really make that connection. So you've got this whole entire speech where you grabbed your audience's attention, and then you've got your main points with smooth transitions that kept your speech fluid. And then you kind of conclude with like a bang, right? Everybody knows what you talked about. And it's like, you can almost see light bulbs going off in people's heads. So that's what you really want to look for in your conclusion. All right, now back to storytelling. So the idea with storytelling is, again, know your purpose. Depending on the situation, depending on your department, depending on the context, storytelling is not always appropriate. So be sure that you know that in advance when you're preparing for your speeches. But if you choose to do storytelling, be sure you get it right, because this is really important. So we're comm scholars, Rachel and I, and there's a famous scholar named Walter Fisher. And he used this saying, instead of saying we're Homo sapiens, he calls us Homo neurons, essentially saying that we are storytelling beings or storytelling humans. And so I love this word because it characterizes us as like storytellers, inherently born to tell stories. We have stories told to us by our relatives that are handed down from generation to generation. We tell stories to our friends about what we did last night. We teach our children things through storytelling about morals and values. So it really helps us make sense of the world around us. It helps us share identities, those values. And when it comes to public speaking, all these things are important because it helps you identify with your audience. And when your audience then identifies with you, you've got really, really persuasive power on your side. And not only that, but if you're informing somebody, it just makes really great community connections as well. So this is the key idea of storytelling. So when you think, and if you decide to do storytelling in your speech, perhaps in your introduction, think about how you're going to draw on the audience. How is it relevant to them? And then just like any story is also going to have a plot, so the middle. And as you're thinking about this story, if you're only going to tell a story, you could also think about these being your main points, a beginning, a middle, and end. What are those? Are there 3 points, 4 points, 5 points, whatever your situation calls for? And even sometimes in the middle, there's a climax, right? So you'll want to identify where you put that in your story. And then your ending. Endings can have some sort of resolution or a lesson that you learned. But if it comes to your research, yes, that's a story too, right? So if you're presenting research, you can tell that evolution. And again, this is completely contextual and situational, right? If we think about certain departments, you're not going to want to put your subject position into a research project. But if you're presenting on something in a seminar, if you're presenting something in your dissertation to your dissertation committee, you might be thinking about, how did I come to study this phenomenon? Why is this important to me? Who am I in this research, right? Why is this important, not just to me, but also people who look like me? So you might be thinking about those things, and even like the way that research started, right? We usually pick research that we enjoy. It's somehow we're passionate about that thing. That's a story. So really, stories are everywhere. Stories are on television all the time, and advertising and public relations, how we see businesses. Nonprofit organizations have slogans, and they go out in the community and they portray a story that identify their values. Even the medical field, right? When they talk to their patients and when they talk to their coworkers, academia, right? I talked about your research, that's a story. We see stories in sports, hospitality, biology. Life is a big story, so if you can include it into your speech, into a proposal, into anything where it's appropriate, it's a really great tool that you can use to identify with your audience a little bit on a deeper level. All right, so I'm going to hand it back over to Rachel, and she's going to go over some techniques to improve presentation skills.
Awesome. Thank you, Steph.
You're good.
Hello again, everyone. So now we're going to go over some tips and tricks, some techniques for thinking about how we present ourselves as we're going through the speech or the presentation. So in the field of comm studies, we know this as delivery. Now, depending upon the situation or the occasion that calls for you to speak, whether someone asked you to come and give a presentation about your research, or maybe you're asked to teach a class, or maybe you're preparing for the grad slam, these situations will call for different methods of delivery. So we're going to go over the 3 types of methods that you will probably utilize. And the 4th method, impromptu delivery, is probably not something that you are necessarily going to utilize to present your research. And that's just because there's not much in way of preparation for impromptu speeches. So the first is a manuscript delivery. Second is a memorized delivery. Third is a kind of in between a memorized and a manuscript delivery, and it's known as an extemporaneous delivery. It's often one of the hardest words to say, extemporaneous, but it's one of the most commonly used forms of delivery. And then finally, impromptu, but we're not going to talk about that much today. So first, a manuscript delivery. You probably already know what a manuscript delivery is, and oftentimes when you think of speeches, this might be the first kind of delivery that you think of. So you've seen a speech before given by a politician or somebody who's running for a political seat, or even coming up, I believe later this semester, President Whitfield's State of the University. He will most likely use a manuscript delivery. So a manuscript delivery is simply just a method of delivery in which the speaker reads from a script word for word. Now, if you are asked to give a speech, and if that speech is probably going to be longer than, say, 5 to 7 minutes, you will want to possibly consider using a manuscript delivery. The longer the speech is, those are the situations in which you want to use a manuscript. But I do want to note here and really emphasize that regardless of the type of method of delivery that you use, you should always outline your ideas. You should always put your words on paper. You never want to keep them in your mind, even if you're going to give a memorized speech. So a manuscript delivery usually occurs when a speaker has either the notes right in front of them, so they may have a podium, or there's a teleprompter in front of them. So you may have seen those screens when, for example, President Biden speaks. They're like, what are those weird screens right there? Well, those screens have the words of his speech on them. And that's because typically in those situations, they don't write their speeches anyways. They have someone doing it for them. So they are fed the words of their speech. Now, there are some pros to this. First being that you have your notes in front of you, so you're less likely to mess up. Also, there's less of an emphasis on practice because you have the words in front of you. In those situations, you just may need to practice your actual delivery in terms of your nonverbal delivery. So what gestures you're going to make, how you're going to stand, when you want to give one of Bill Clinton's good, he loves doing this, his little hand gesture here. But there are some major drawbacks to this kind of delivery. The first is that it's low eye contact with the audience and low engagement in general with the audience. That's because most of the time you're looking down at your paper. And this can actually inhibit the execution of your speech if you're trying to compel the audience to do something. So if you want to persuade them to take some sort of action or to believe something, to vote for you to win the grad slam, you probably want to have a good eye contact. So if you're in a situation in which you really want to engage with the audience, then you may not want to use a manuscript delivery. Not only that, you're very susceptible to losing your spot in your notes. So I have my notes over here, and if I'm reading directly from them, I'm ignoring you guys because I'm more concerned about making sure that I get my words correct. I'm not going to be looking at you much, but it's also going to be difficult for me when I do actually look up towards the audience and I look back down to find my spot, especially if I wrote my notes or if I wrote my outline as an essay or an actual manuscript. So you can lose your spot in your notes, but you need to make sure that you can either highlight, use color to indicate maybe those situations when you want to look up to the audience and then back down to your notes. So a manuscript delivery can be good because you're less of a chance of messing up, so to say, but there's less of a connection with the audience. Then we have a memorized delivery, and that's the exact opposite. So in a memorized speech, you as the speaker recall all the words of your presentation or your speech from memory. Now, this can be a useful method of delivery if your speech is short. So if you're giving a toast, for example, at a wedding, or maybe if you're giving a eulogy, depending upon your relationship with that person, you may want to use a memorized delivery. So shorter speeches, maybe less than 3 minutes, are good situations to use memorized delivery. However, if your speech is longer than, say, 2 or 3 minutes, it's really going to be difficult because our capacity to remember specific words in a sequence is somewhat of an art, and it takes a lot of practice. So one of the pros of utilizing this method of delivery is that there's much eye contact and engagement with the audience. And in those situations, the audience can identify with you more because you're engaging with them. I always like to come into class on the day we talk about delivery, and I'll come in and I'll speak like this and say, "You guys excited for class today? You ready?" And they're like, "What are you doing?" And then I look up and I'm like, "You guys excited for class today?" And they're like, "Yeah, let's go." So having that eye contact and engagement with the audience is crucial. And we're going to talk more, or I'm going to talk more about that in a few moments. Additionally, in the situations in which you're utilizing a memorized delivery, you don't need note cards or notes. Now, like I said earlier, that doesn't mean that you don't actually put your ideas and words on paper. You still do that. What differs between these methods of delivery is how you utilize those notes. So if you don't have any notes in front of you, chances are you're not going to get in a situation where you drop them and get them all mixed up like I did earlier this week, and it was a pain. So you don't have to worry about mixing up your notes in any way. However, if we memorize our speeches, and one of the drawbacks of doing this is that we are so particular about the words that we say in that presentation or speech. So if we mess up just one word, and that one word leads us into the next sequence of words, our whole presentation can go off the trails. And trust me, you don't want to go off any trails. I've done it on a bike before and it hurts. So make sure that if you are in a situation where you're going to memorize a speech, that you're not necessarily putting too much emphasis on particular words, because if you get off track, if you mess up once, that could be it. Your mind could go blank, and then you're standing up in front of an audience looking at them and you don't know what to say. One of the second major drawbacks of giving a memorized speech is that it requires a lot of practice. Because again, remember, you're focused on remembering particular words in a particular order. And it takes a lot of practice to memorize that. It's going to take a lot of sittings where you're looking through your notes and remembering. And chances are you probably know your introduction very well because that's where you start, but you don't know your body or your conclusion as well. So if you are going to use a memorized delivery, what I like to tell my students is feel free to start at any different point in your speech. Don't always start with your introduction, because if you always start with your intro, that's the one thing that you're really going to know. Sometimes start in the body or start at the conclusion. Make sure that you practice each of these pieces with sufficient time. And then there's extemporaneous delivery. Extemporaneous delivery is actually the middle ground between a manuscript and a memorized delivery. Again, you still have notes, you still put all of your words and ideas on a piece of paper or into a Word document, but what's different is how you utilize those notes. So in an extemporaneous delivery, you still have your notes with you in front of you, but you don't use them as much as you would if you were giving a speech with a manuscript. So this is a method of delivery in which the speaker utilizes their notes. They're prepared ahead of time. They remember key ideas, words, and phrases, but they're not necessarily connected to specific words. So this type of delivery requires you to know your ideas and your points, but to practice saying them in different ways. So convey the meaning of that point using different words. This morning when Stephanie and I were practicing, I can guarantee you that much of what we say now was phrased differently than it was this morning, and was phrased differently from when we thought about what we were going to say in the first place. So practice saying your ideas, but describing them using different words. So some of the pros of this. Number one, the ability to practice. You're not going to be practicing as much, and you can be very flexible and adaptable in your practicing style. Second, your engagement with the audience. The audience will view you more favorably because it seems more like a conversation. Just you and a friend talking, even if there's 100 people sitting in front of you. Because you're making eye contact with them, you seem more authentic. And so that will come across favorably. And we're going to talk about delivery components in a moment here. And even though what we say is important, or the message that we're trying to get across is important, how we present ourselves when we say that message can be just as important, at least in the audience's eyes. Then there's some of the drawbacks. This type of delivery takes some practicing and getting used to. So the first times that you do it, the first several speaking situations, it can induce some anxiety. So like I said earlier, take every opportunity that you get to speak and practice extemporaneous delivery to gain that experience. So now I want to move on to talk a little bit about delivery or components of delivery. And we can break down delivery into two categories. First being nonverbal delivery, or what you may know as body language. Now, the most important piece of nonverbal delivery is your eye contact. This is crucial. If you're not willing to look at the audience, if you're too nervous to look at the audience sitting in front of you is going to be like, why should I care? Why should I listen if that person's not even going to look at me? Why should I be compelled by what they have to say if they're not even looking at me? So eye contact is crucial. And not just making eye contact with an individual audience member. And I feel bad, you guys are sitting right here and I'm like not looking at you. I'm breaking my own rules. But scanning the audience. So let's say you have, a room of 50 people in front of you. Don't just look at those who are in the front row or those who are in the back row by the clock. Look at everyone, right? You want to connect with everyone as a speaker. So eye contact is crucial. And it can be one of the things that can really inhibit your speech if you're not making good eye contact with the audience. Second is facial expressions. Sometimes when we're giving a speech, we get so focused on making sure that we say what we need to say that we don't pay attention to how we present ourselves to the audience. And one of the things in particular is how we present our face. Now, you guys can't really see my face because my mask. But when we very first start getting in the habit of speaking, we don't think of how our emotions come across our face. And this is important. If we are nervous, or if when we get nervous, we kind of shut down in our face, and we may, have this facial expression where we seem like we're mad or mean, we want to try to get out of the habit of having that. So when you are in a speaking situation, try your best to be enthusiastic and smile. If you're smiling, chances are the audience is going to be more receptive to that. Then there's hand gestures. Now, when it comes to hand gestures, you need to make sure that you are being strategic. So this requires some practice. And really what you want to avoid is having any distracting hand gestures. So for some, that may be tapping on the podium if you have a podium in front of you. For others, it may be, can't think of any of the ones that I've seen lately. It may be, clicking your fingers, or maybe it's I know I get in the habit of doing this sometimes. I have sometimes when I teach, I keep a whiteboard marker in my hand, and sometimes I play with the cap. So you want to get out of the habit of having those distracting gestures. And then finally, posture. Posture is important. You don't want to be slumped over like this. You want to stand up straight. You want to be poised. You want to look professional. And one thing you, again, want to make sure that you avoid is any posture or any movements that become distracting. So moving from side to side, or now in today's virtual world, if you're sitting down, getting out of the habit of swiveling in your chair, that can be distracting and something that the audience picks up on and can get in the way of your verbal message, which is actually what we're going to talk about next. Our verbal communication. Now, verbal communication is important because we, of course, want the audience to do something with the information that we give them. So there's a few things that we need to pay attention to. First of which is our tone. We want to make sure that we have a variety, or we vary the tone. We want to make sure that we have inflections in our voice. Who in here has seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off? Long time ago? Y'all, the teacher. Do you remember the teacher? No? Okay, so you all need to go back and watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It's really funny. So that's your homework assignment. But there's one character in particular. Yes, anyone? The teacher. So monotone. It really takes away from what's going on. So make sure that you are varying your tone. Not only that, it can be useful to use strategic pauses. So this is different from a vocalized pause, but a strategic pause is stopping. It can be useful to indicate to the audience that something important is coming up, or that you're done with the point. Or, as Stephanie said earlier today, which I really laughed at, if you have a student who may be sleeping, or someone sleeping, if you pause, they may wake up. Avoid vocalized pauses. So those are a little bit different than strategic pauses. Those are the uhs and the ums that we tend to say when we're thinking of what to say next. Now, this is hard. It takes some practice, but slowing down your mind helps with avoiding uhs and ums. And sometimes it can present itself differently, so it can come in the form of, like, you say like a lot. Next is your vocal rate. You don't want to speak too fast or too slow. You want to find that conversational rate that you speak with your friends. And then finally, making sure that you project your voice so the audience can hear you. And then the setting of the presentation. This is important. So if you're giving an in-person presentation, you need to consider what technology needs that you have, and then also what that venue or that room has to offer. So if you have a video that you want to play, make sure there's a computer there. If you have audio concerns, make sure you're paying attention that the audience can hear that audio. Ask the organizer of the event if there's a projector there so that you can bring in a visual aid if you need to. If you're going to have a clicker, if you need to bring your own computer, or if they're going to supply the computer, any cords that you need. So if you utilize a Mac, make sure that you have the Thunderbolt lightning plug-in, or if you utilize a PC, make sure you have something with a USB. And then ask if you need a microphone or not. That also requires you to take an inventory of the layout of the room. So how many people are going to be in the room, and how large is this room? Do I need a microphone, or do I think that I can project my voice loud enough? And then, of course, virtually, there's some things to pay attention to as well. So first, determining the type of video conferencing platform that you're going to use. And this may vary depending upon how many people are going to attend. So I know with Zoom, I believe it's with Zoom, only 24 people can attend one meeting on a free account. So if you know you're going to have more than 24 people there, you need to find a different platform. or if you need the capabilities like today in sharing your screen, or if you need a chat box. So those factors are going to influence what video conferencing platform you use, considering whether you need to sit or stand. And Stephanie earlier today, Stephanie and I were talking about this. Should we sit? Should we stand? If you have technology needs that you have to operate yourself, you may need to sit. But if you have someone working the technology for you, you can stand. Standing is more professional, but that will require that you also raise your laptop or the camera so that it's at eye level. Consider asking the audience to mute like we did today, if you need any lighting to show your beautiful face, and eye contact. Something different about virtual presentations is that the eye contact comes with the camera. So don't look at your screen, make sure that you're looking at the camera. And then visual aids. Really, when it comes to visual aids, keeping it simple is key. You do not want chunks or blocks of text on your visual aid. Your audience is not going to be able to read that while you also speak. We may think we're good at multitasking, but sometimes we're really not. And especially when it comes to communication, it's really difficult. So the less is honestly more in these situations. No more than 6 items per slide, whether it be in bullet points or pictures or graphs. Incorporate some animations if the setting allows for it. So if you know you have access to a clicker, use animations. Otherwise, it may be distracting if you always have to walk back to the computer to go to the next bullet point or the next slide. Then spice up your slide with some pictures. So add in some visuals, whether it be a graph or a chart or a picture or a video. But you don't want it to just be white or dark, depending upon what kind of theme you use. Consider your font. Make sure it's big enough so the audience can see. Make sure you're using a style that is readable. And then also make sure you're paying attention to color needs. There may be a situation where your audience may be colorblind. So make sure you're using colors that everyone can see. And then finally, be strategic about how you position your body to the visual aid. Now, that's not much of an issue with us today, but say you were presenting in front of a screen like we have here, make sure that you're not blocking the visual aid and your audience can't see it. But at the same time, make sure that if your visual aid is behind you, that you're not just looking at the visual aid the whole time. So make sure that you're paying attention to how you are in physical relationship to your visual aid. I know we're getting close on time, but I'm going to pass it back to Stephanie, and she's going to talk a little bit more about thinking of the audience and what they bring to the table in a speaking situation.
All right, I will try to wrap this up quickly for y'all. All right, so this statistic that's been going around for a couple of years now is that employers are actually looking for this #1 skill, and that's communication. Whether it be in academia or out in the corporate world, this is the #1 thing. So ways that we can get to know our audience are several different bullet points here, but thank goodness for the internet because it really makes things easier for us. So if you're going to go to another city, another university, another country, you can get online and you can search for the demographics of that area. So you can look for political affiliation, age, gender, religion, et cetera, et cetera. So you can really look for these things to help you just know your audience. What are their values? What are their belief systems? You can also look at company websites, look at their mission statements and also their values. If you're going to go overseas or you're going to speak to a specific group, maybe their cultures are different. Maybe certain phrases, hand gestures, greetings are not acceptable in those cultures, and you might need to adjust how you communicate with them. So this is why employers are looking for this, right? We have a very diverse country, very diverse state and university. And so when we look at how we communicate to different audiences, it's important to know who we're talking to first. So Got ahead of myself. But also reach out to peers and colleagues. Academia is a very small world. So if you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody where you're going to go, or maybe they work there, utilize those resources too, because colleagues and peers can also be an asset to help you understand the audience you'll be speaking to. And then in real time, you can understand your audience. You can be looking at, like Rachel said, sometimes your audience falls asleep, right? You might see people looking at their watches, heading out the room, shifting in their seats. If they're doing those things in real time, you're surveying your audience, and you might need to switch things up a bit. You might need to go start telling a story. I always go to humor. I think I'm funny. Some people do, some people don't. But also, when you're looking at who is interested in your audience in real-time surveying, look for those people who are interested in giving you positive feedback. Are they nodding their heads? Are they giving you really great eye contact? I mean, hopefully they're not clapping in the middle of your speech unless it's an appropriate time. But even now, I tell everybody I've got these eyebrows I keep shifting around. It's my new way to smile, right? So looking at people's eyebrows and facial expressions to see if they're interested and make sure that you're on the right track with your audience. And another way, if it's applicable to the situation, you could reach out to the venue, you could reach out to the university or the corporation and ask them if you can send a survey to the people who are going to be in attendance. You can do surveys on Momentive, Qualtrics, Google Forms, and you can ask them specific questions. Maybe you're talking on a controversial topic and you want to know who's there, to know if people disagree with you. Then you can go back and do your research, and then you can come back with some information that might actually persuade that person who disagrees with you, or maybe you can come to a mutual understanding of some sort. But just know that polling your audience doesn't always work, because sometimes if you have a really large audience, like 50, 100, 200 people, you just know that there's going to be people of mixed beliefs, cultures, and attitudes. And so it's really important to go in and be really adaptable with your communication, especially if you're going to talk on a topic that's like really jargon filled. You'll want to break that down a little bit and talk in layperson's terms so that everybody can understand it. So today, Rachel and I went over those strategies for overcoming communication apprehension or speech anxiety. We gave you some tips and tricks for preparing a speech or presentation. And we also went over how to improve those presentation skills and then adapting a speech to an audience. So we hope that you really found this helpful, and also some additional help that you might be able to utilize is our Comm Lab. Rachel already mentioned before. Please take a picture or screenshot of this. Follow us on Instagram at commlab_UNLV. We have an amazing new Comm Lab that's on the 4th floor of Greenspun College of Urban Affairs. And in this, in our department, there's 2 rooms that have whisper rooms. Now these are like soundproof booths. You can actually come in and you can practice your dissertation presentations, seminar presentations, presentations for any class, for a conference, whatever it is. There's computers in there. You can record yourself, email it to yourself, watch it, see how you improve over time. Then we even have coaches who can help you and kind of guide you through and give you tips. They can also listen to you give your presentation or your speech and give you real-time feedback. And then also an important thing to note about our Comm Lab is you can also make virtual appointments. So if you go to the website, you can actually join one of our coaches online, and you can practice delivering your speech in a virtual setting. They can help you do research, outlining. What else? Am I missing anything, Rachel?
Delivery.
Research, outlining, delivery, nonverbal communication, all of that stuff. If you're having trouble doing any research, they can help you with that as well. So please hit us up, and we really hope that you enjoyed our presentation today.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So thank you for joining us virtually and here in person. Before we jump off, I would love for you to please fill out the feedback form that Jasmine is going to drop in the chat. This really helps us to improve our programming and to really tailor our programming to what interests you and to get better over time. So once again, thank you very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.